One of the sensitivities I have is for people from outside of Palestine trying to tell us how we should perform or look or act. One of the things we should recognize at this particular political moment, while the secular, perhaps left and nationalists played a big role in the 70s and 80s in the Palestinian struggle, today these forces have either sold out or are weakened and have very little role. And since the 80s, the mantle of resistance, defiance, the organizational capacity, the accumulation of power has been moved or shifted towards political movements and formations that adopt this idea of Islamic universality, including movements like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others. That's the reality. And these are the political forces that now have more legitimacy in the eyes of the everyday Palestinian.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is the ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories, and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right, resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Abdaljawad Omar. Abdaljawad is a Palestinian assistant professor and writer joining us all the way from Al-Bireh, Palestine. Abdaljawad teaches in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Abdaljawad University. His work explores questions of colonialism, resistance, and ideology with a focus on Palestine. In addition to his academic research, Abdaljawad is a regular contributor to Mondoweiss, Electronic Intifada, and other publications where he provides commentary on contemporary political and intellectual developments. I hope you'll find my conversation with Abdaljawad useful and productive. Enjoy. Abdaljawad, welcome to the conversation all the way from Al-Bireh, the homeland.
Thank you, Habibi Ahmed. Thank you.
Tislam, you're welcome. Abdaljawad, I want to start by addressing the title of today's conversation, teetering on the brink of a new Middle East. We've seen Trump making those blatant statements of displacing the Palestinians from Gaza and probably the West Bank. We've seen the futile, almost humiliating position that King Abdullah has taken upon meeting with Trump, although he did make a stern announcement rejecting that plan afterwards. We've also heard many perfunctory statements coming out of the so-called Arab leadership, albeit also stern. But I guess we are used to these kind of, performative postures. But, even before Trump came to power, one can argue that we were seeing gradual seismic shifts occurring within the Middle East, preparing to this moment, especially, talking about October the 7th, which caught the entire region, if not the entire world, by surprise. An operation that eventuated in making huge geopolitical shifts. We've seen the Palestinian Authority shifting further and further to the side of the occupier with what's happening in Jenin refugee camp and in the West Bank in general. We've seen the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, the complete elimination of Hezbollah's leadership. The assault on Lebanon may have not terminally weakened Hezbollah, but it did a lot of damage to it. Then there is the rise of Turkey, encroachment in the region as opposed to Iran. Iran has lost an important piece of the axis of resistance, that is Syria. And it could be said that, now Iran finds itself exposed to the elements, if you will, now that their, main strategy of establishing a regional built, if you like, of deterrence around it, represented by the axis of resistance. But the core issue that has initiated the whole thing remains, which is, the steadfastness of the Palestinian resistance, despite the genocide, despite the atrocities, and so on, and despite the plans of ethnic cleansing. And so Trump makes this announcement following all that upheaval that was shaking the Middle East. So my question to you is, and I know it's a loaded question, are we indeed teetering on the brink of a new Middle East, as the title suggests? And, how does this new Middle East look like? I mean, we'll talk about the details later on. We'll unpack it. But if you could give us your initial thoughts.
Well, thank you for the question. I've grown, Ahmad, sensitive to the word New Middle East because in our region we've heard it quite a lot, repeated. There's a lot of, imperial managers from the United States and others who always speak of a new Middle East or the birth pains of new Middle East. And it usually accompanies, these moments of war, and war, as we all know, is a moment where, uncertainty, unpredictability reigns, no? And I still think to some degree that what, unfolded since October 7th still maintains this level of, fogginess and uncertainty, meaning that it's quite hard to really delineate where the region will actually head in terms of, will it actually, in the next couple of years, will we see a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement that accompanies also a peace agreement with Syria, a delineation of the land borders with Lebanon, and then Israel can be, or feel more secure without solving the Palestinian issue or giving any attention to the Palestinian rights to self-determination, dignity, freedom, etc. Will we see, the right-wing fascist messianic government in Israel still leading Israel, heading towards continuation of genocide and ethnic cleansing and attempting to eradicate and erase the Palestinian people? So we're in this moment where still things hang, but there is one level of this war, one chapter of it that is or has been slowly closing down. Because I think one of the elements also of October 7th, it was a moment of pure potentiality. There was like a lot of potential. It opened the political space. And as the war commenced and as the results of battles, come to light, we can see two developments. One that is highly favorable to Israel is that its geostrategic position, specifically vis-a-vis its northern borders, whether in Lebanon or Syria, are more favorable. It battered, as you said, Hezbollah, although Hezbollah remains and still has its capacity to fight and is rebuilding, etc. It did not end or kill Hezbollah, but it weakened and battered Hezbollah significantly. And at the same time, you have a change of regime in Syria, a weakened Syria, the destruction of the Syrian army and its equipment. And Israel now has taken also around 400 kilometers square of land within Syria itself. So it looks at the picture, and I think for viewing this war and viewing the results of this war, it feels that the geostrategic position that it finds itself, specifically on the northern borders, is quite favorable. It has less worries, at least at this moment, moving forward when it comes to powers that potentially could challenge it on these northern borders. So that's one significant result in terms of Israel. On the other front, it looks at Gaza, and in Gaza, it has relatively failed. What it succeeded in is the destruction of Gaza, which is significant, because for 15 months, the world, the United States, Europe, a lot of Western countries have continued to sell Israel arms. And this is one of the truths that come out of the war as well, which I think people should place in mind, how dependent Israel is on Western powers. And that's why it's significant also in terms of, activism, specifically in the core countries, whether it's Australia or America or Canada or, Europe more broadly, is significant because that dependency is also a weakness in Israel. Israel could not continue this war without the flow of arms that came from the United States and other European countries that were happily supporting it and supplanting it with the weapons to destroy Gaza. But the thing is that dependency, Israel was able to destroy, commit massacres, commit this genocidal war without any kind of repercussions, at least from the centers of power. I mean, not to say that there's no repercussions, because Israel has lost a lot of its moral and ethical and diplomatic and legal standing in the world. But at the same time, still the power centers in the world backed it up. So that's success. It's success because it sent a message to the Palestinians everywhere and to Arabs more broadly, and perhaps to the world more broadly, that it can get away with a lot. No, it can transgress the limits of war, the limits of international law, international laws that codify the practices of war, and that it will still find diplomatic, political, emotional, effective support coming from these centers of power, providing it with arms. But that success in Gaza, of destroying Gaza, of committing these massacres, was not really did not really transform Gaza, or did not really, defeat the armed resistance, or defeat the Palestinian people resilience, at least in asserting and affirming their lives in Gaza, the desire to rebuild Gaza, the desire to remain in Gaza. And eventually we got the ceasefire agreement, and I think we should view the ceasefire agreement, specifically in relation to Gaza, as an Israeli failure, because Israel spoke of total victory and it got relative success and relative failure in Gaza. It did not really change the strategic picture quite significantly. So this is the fact when it comes to Gaza. Hamas remains in Gaza. The Palestinian armed resistance in all its factions remains in Gaza. They still have tens of thousands of fighters. They're still capable of maintaining a guerrilla fighting force for a long term in Gaza. Israel, again, was not totally successful, or not strategically successful in Gaza. But what's the difference here, and where we're at this moment is that now, looking at, Hamas is battered, Gaza is destroyed, Israel holds levers and leverage over the reconstruction of Gaza. It holds lever and leverage also on the reconstruction in Lebanon, as we're seeing now today with the new government in Lebanon, and with the air flights from Tehran to Beirut being stopped, and with different practices and policies that are meant to choke the Shia community in Lebanon's ability to rebuild the homes and villages in the south and other areas of Lebanon. So it holds levers that are tied to the reconstruction. Reconstruction also needs Arab support, so Arab government support and Arab financial support as well. And this is where the Arabs have also some leverage in this whole, coming negotiations, if you want, on a regional scale, not only, between the U.S. and Israel, but between the U.S. and Israel, and the U.S. and the Arab allies of the U.S. in the region more broadly. And I think, everybody's setting their own agenda on the table. So Israel, through Trump, has been setting this, agenda of, we need to get now Gaza ethnically cleansed and encourage the people to leave Gaza. That's the role at least Trump is playing, and interplaying with Netanyahu, giving him the speech and the discourse that slowly normalizes and synthesizes the idea of ethnically cleansing the Gazans and completely eradicating Palestinian presence in the Gaza Strip more broadly. And that's what Trump is doing in his own way, of course, as a real estate, developer, as somebody who looks at land as a commodity form, as somebody, he speaks the speak that, resonates with him and perhaps his son-in-law who only look at, land as, a venture for profitability, and that's the nature of the discourse. And, one of the ironies as well that I saw in Trump's speech as well, not only because it's obscene and shameless and, does not understand Palestinian relationship to land as well, but, that he spoke that America will take over Gaza, not Israel will take over Gaza, because I think there's still that tension between Trump and Netanyahu. And I think Trump on one level does not want to give, it's not that we're going to go into Gaza and give it to Israel. No, it's we Americans are going to come and to transform it into the Riviera of the Middle East, etc., etc. So there's that level of at least a tension between these two figures, and him kind of, not wanting to like say Israel will take it over. But I think that generally there's now an attempt to fill the void. What transpires after this war politically? How does this war transform from battles fought on the ground, realities that have been, accumulated throughout the 15 months of war, into a political arrangement in the coming months and years? So this is where I think the region is at this moment, and there's a lot of uncertainty around, the position of the new Syrian regime, for instance. Is it going to be more, interested in becoming part of the Abrahamic Accord camp, or want to maintain some sort of relationship with its, past enemies? And, since now Israel occupies part of the Golan, perhaps engage in some sort of resistance, or at least build relationships with, Iran and Hezbollah. And what will happen with this new Syrian regime? What will happen in terms of the Syrian regime's relationship with Turkey? And to what extent will Turkey exert its influence over the new Syria economically and politically and diplomatically and strategically? So there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the position of Syria. Is the new regime in Syria, will it play a role in choking Hezbollah in Lebanon and pressuring, Hezbollah and weakening it and containing it through a mix of, land, preventing the land corridor from Iran to Lebanon to move forward, but also more so in interfering more proactively in Lebanese politics, or even engaging in fights across the borders between Lebanon and Syria. So there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the position of the new Syrian regime that has come to the fore. Syria is, in a dire mess. It needs also a lot of reconstruction. It needs to rebuild its economy. It needs to reintegrate a lot of its population that has become refugees across, the world, including in Turkey, Jordan, and other places. A lot of people are returning. And, it's in a highly uncertain environment, with still sanctions being placed on it. And a lot of, actors in the region are looking at the new Syrian regime and seeing what cards they will play and where they are heading strategically. So in a nutshell, we're still in this uncertain moment. We don't know still the position of Saudi Arabia. Will Saudi Arabia push directly for the establishment, for instance, of a Palestinian state as a precursor for, or a precondition for, normalization? Or will they, move away from normalization because of the massacres and the genocide, etc.? Will they play a more proactive role in resolving the issue around reconstruction in Gaza? Will they maintain distance? There's still a lot of uncertainty around, for instance, an important country, at least in terms of its geostrategic position and its financial capacity, like Saudi Arabia, as it determines, its own interest in relation to Israel, but also in relation to the Palestinian cause more directly. And, the role of Qatar and the role of the Americans, and the pressure that is being placed now on Jordan and Egypt, perhaps, to accept this kind of absurd Trumpian proposal for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which I think, we can talk perhaps about why these countries will not, necessarily agree to it, not because out of love of Palestine and the Palestinians, but for instance, with Egypt, allowing 2.2 million Palestinians from Gaza, or we don't know the number exactly now, but allowing them into Sinai, for instance, is a security problem, no? Because you're moving a population of 2 million people who have a well-developed resistance culture in an area that is sparsely populated, like Sinai, for instance. And they will cause Egypt a lot of headache, because either they will have to confront and contain this population and securitize this population and arrest a lot of it and do a lot of repression against the Palestinians in order to prevent them from fighting on the borders with Israel once again. Or they will, they will have to cede control over Sinai and, have some sort of Palestinian entity arise there that will also still try and attempt to resist or hassle Israel, or will actually also, bring Egypt and Israel into more direct confrontation with each other. So for Egypt, looking at the situation, they have a problem. In ethnically cleansing Gaza, they also lose one of the strategic cards they usually play in terms of negotiation, mediation, in terms of their relevance to the Americans and to their allies. So by eradicating, the source that makes them also more relevant to the imperial or to the empire and to Israel itself, they also are ceding, if you want, one asset or one geostrategic asset that allows or continues or permits the American Congress to still feed the Egyptian army with a lot of money every year, around $1.3 billion every year. And also they play this role. So for them, Gaza is important to remain where it is and for Palestinians to remain on the land. And of course, there is perhaps also a level of it that, the Arabs, even though they are, in many ways, Arab regimes, very respectful towards American and Israeli wishes and under American hegemony, but there is still a level that permitting the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, specifically when you have when you have a relationship with Israel, you're not an enemy of Israel, will only serve to erode your internal legitimacy in the eyes of your own population and create problems and headache down the road for a lot of these regimes. It's the same thing for Jordan. Jordan, if it permits the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in the West Bank or in Gaza, it loses, the Jordanian regime will lose its hold over the territory because you'll have a majority Palestinian population, many of them newly or freshly coming to Jordan. And, and Palestinians, Ahmed, we're not very, we disturb the we make problems. No, we're troublemakers. I mean, and we're not gonna sit idle and give up. We'll start to find new ways to fight. And we should remember that after Nakba in 1948, the center for the Palestinian struggle was from outside of Palestine, not inside Palestine like it is today. And that could be a chapter that these regimes will suffer from uncertainty in their future. They will suffer from new headaches as they confront the Palestinians that are coming in and try to repress them politically. They will suffer from the erosion of legitimacy. So for them, it's quite hard to accept this kind of agreement. But what's significant about what Trump is saying is first this discursive normalization, and second, and I think this is important, is that it's positioning a negotiating position, because Israel, after this war, does not want to talk about Palestinian rights. It does not want to talk a political grammar. It wants to maintain the Palestinian issue as a manageable security issue, as something it outsources financially to Europe and the Arabs. It doesn't cost it money, but at the same time, without thinking or being pressured or having any form of political grammar that, how do we live, between the river and the sea in equality, with dignity and with respect for all humans that live in this area.
Mm. Back to the Arab countries agreeing with Trump's plans. Do you think also there's an element of fear from their own nations? I mean, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, was once quoted that, he doesn't care about Palestinians per se, and he doesn't care if they get a country or not, but his people do care. And so do you think there is a fear? I mean, to my understanding, to my readings, it sounds like if there's an agreement with Trump's plan by the Arab leadership, it's like a political suicide for them. We might be expecting another, Arab Springs.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't go that far. Not because the Arabs, the population of these countries would agree to ethnic cleansing. I did say that it will erode the legitimacy. In the case of Jordan, yes, there's a very high risk on the regime itself because, Jordan is already, around 50 to 60% Palestinian. There's no real numbers, no. And, if an influx of new Palestinians come in, that creates a lot of problems in terms of the Jordanian regime ability to actually really manage the population. And you can see a transformation in the regime itself. But I think that in the case of other Arab countries, it does erode their legitimacy. But remember, Ahmad, one of the facets that we have seen throughout the 15 months is that we haven't really seen the Arab populations being able to really muster opposition in a voice, in a proactive, forceful manner, no? And there's a lot of reasons for that, because we have a decade of state repression in a lot of these countries. after the Arab Spring and after the demonstrations that engulfed Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, etc. We have civil wars that erupted. We have the erosion of organizational capacities that in Egyptian civil society. In Egypt, we talk about 15,000 political prisoners that are now in prison, no? So and even more. So there's this wide scale repression against any form of opposition in many of these states. And that creates a lot of problems. In the Gulf states, for instance, like Saudi Arabia, the regimes that exist there with the financial capacities they have, the population, there's more stability generally in the relationship between the governments and their population. And it doesn't mean that the population agrees with everything the government says or finds everything that the government is doing representative of its own, if you want, identity, affect, and, ambitions and collective dreams and hopes. But there's still enough of financial power for these regimes to sustain stability and to maintain it in the long term. So I don't think we can hinge on this idea that it's political suicide per se in the manner of the population will cause or Saudis will rise to the streets and will start protesting and do a revolution because of that. No, I don't think that's going to be the case. It does erode the legitimacy of these regimes. It does risk uncertainty. It also places Palestinians in direct confrontation with these regimes, specifically in areas that they will, enter to. Remember, Palestinians have always been on the forefront of political revolutionary movements in the Arab world, in organizing these movements, and disturbing politics in regional states, specifically within countries that, are generally on good terms with, American hegemony in the region. And that will cause, of course, problems and even more uncertainty and even more revolutionary practices coming and emanating in opposition to some of the policies of these states, etc. But other than that, I mean, we shouldn't hinge, a bet on, the Arab populations rising, at least at this moment, when you don't see organizations, when you don't see an active civil society, and when you see this kind of wide-scale repression happening. Could this change in the future? Yes. Perhaps even the war, the past 15 months will be an inducement towards a more active and politically participant Arab street. That is a possibility that is coming out of this war as well, as people think of this moment politically, etc. But I think at this moment, the Arab populations in many of the countries that we're speaking of just simply lack the political organization to be able to mount real resistance against the state if the state decides on a certain policy.
I mean, you spoke about the 15 months of genocide. You spoke about the silence in the Arab world, no demonstrations. You also spoke about the resistance. And so many in the West are wondering, probably in the Middle East as well, did Hamas's October the 7th operation actually achieve its goal after the ceasefire? I mean, what did it reveal about the efficacy of the concept of resistance itself? You spoke about the genocide being a defeat, or the ceasefire after the genocide being a defeat for Israel. Does that mean it's a victory for Hamas?
No, I don't think. Look, I think the victory-defeat binary is quite problematic, no? For two reasons. First of all, Palestine is always at war. There's no real ceasefire, no? Yes, there's an intense episode that happened in Gaza and there's a ceasefire. I'm not denying that, but we're since 1882, since the first colonial, Zionist arrived to Palestine and attempted to build the first settlement in Palestine. Palestine has been in a war, and there's the killings never stop, the arrests never stops. The annexation of land. There's this kind of war of points, no, Ahmad, and this war of points is a slow war. It erodes slowly. It does not necessarily. Sometimes it becomes intense. Sometimes there's an ebbs and flows around this. It relaxes, but at the end of the day, there's no real end of the war in Palestine. This is an important thing that we should place. This is the paradigm which we live in, because there's a war that wants to destroy the Palestinian people, their viability, their claim on the land, and it wants to erase them politically, culturally, and even physically. No, so this is one element of it. the victory defeat paradigm, it's generally speaking, puts a specific set of criteria. For instance, today in Palestinian society, there is a discussion on victory and defeat, and you can easily build a narrative of defeat, and it's correct. No, you can say Gaza is destroyed. Okay, the resistance succeeded in its operation on October 7th, but Gaza is destroyed. The axis of resistance attempted to back the resistance in Gaza, but in many ways it failed. Palestine is not liberated. The political outcomes of this war might be not completely grandiose. We're not seeing necessarily anytime soon, for instance, a resolution, an end of the Zionist regime, or its apartheid system, or whatever form of possible solutions that can be, mustered. And people will say that there is, a defeat. There's tens of thousands killed, tens of thousands of injuries. The West Bank and Palestinians, citizens of Israel and Palestinians in Jerusalem, did not go on the streets in their hundreds of thousands. Gaza was left alone. So there's a lot of that discourse that is quite, that can build a narrative of defeat. And has a lot of, if you want, factors to build that narrative, no? And on the second level, people can also speak of a victory, no? Because the same, perhaps, picture looks like Israel's entire security deterrence logic fell on October 7th. It failed in intelligence. It failed to prevent the attack. The attack commenced. Its southern army was destroyed. And that rupture, that break, will be significant for Israeli society in the coming months and years as they reckon with the failure in their military and intelligence systems. It faced off one of the most besieged fighting forces in the world, yet it wasn't able to defeat it, despite some of the tactical successes, some of the assassinations against some of the leaders of Al-Qassam brigades, for instance, and others, but they weren't able to defeat it. It lost the narrative in the world, and ethically and morally and politically in the eyes of many in the world. Not only did Israel manage to lose a lot of its legitimacy, but also muster a lot of disgust among a lot of people. New generations are being politicized through the issue of Palestine. Much of that is not reversible. No, losing that support will have an impact, perhaps, on the long term, sustainability of the policy that sustains support for Israel. Perhaps not, but in many ways, there's a lot of levers, if you want, and it talked about total victory. It used a lot of force. It went all out. Now, Israel did not reserve its force, short of nuclear weapons being thrown at Gaza, which is not a realistic proposition because Gaza is close to, centers of populations in Israel as well. But it went all out in terms of destruction. It used its power. It unleashed what it had in terms of its power. It exposed its dependency on the West in ways that actually defeat its ideological project, because if Zionism was about self-determination of the Jewish population and also autonomous power of the Jewish population, not being dependent on any external power, despite the fact that it was implanted as and backed by Western powers from the beginning and continues to be backed by these Western powers. And at the same time, it did not really achieve that total victory. So, and in the logic of anti-colonial resistances more broadly, you don't necessarily win by overwhelming your opposition, which has more weapons, technology, etc. You win by, if you want, molding their consciousness, making sure that Israelis reach this kind of conclusion that there's a limit to force and what it can achieve. And if Israelis or within Israeli society, that limit or that realization sinks in, I'm not sure it will. No, there will still be people who say we should use more force and more killing and more. But if that realization seeps in, that the Palestinian people are not defeatable, that they want their rights, their dignity, and that is met perhaps with also pressure on the leadership in Israel coming through boycotts, divestment, sanctions, coming from changed positions. Although I don't see that happening anytime soon, where Israel's impunity ends. We're seeing ICC warrants, but whether governments really change their position based on any kind of civic and democratic engagement with, a rising cohort of voices within many countries that want to see a shift in Israel's policy, that might shift, and that realization might cause a shift in terms of how Israelis view, Palestinians, and view a possible change, a radical change in the way we relate to each other in the, between the river and the sea, in terms of, perhaps decolonization, etc. But I think, for me, yes, there is a disaster in Gaza. And one of the things, Ahmed, I always emphasize, because in Palestinian imagination, disaster is catastrophe is tied to the word Nakba, no? But there's no Nakba in Gaza. There's no, you can disentangle the catastrophe, the humanitarian, the complete destruction of Gaza's built environment, universities, hospitals, the massacres. But there's no real political defeat in Gaza. People did not come out of this war broken. The resistance didn't come out of this war broken or surrendering. There's a defiance. We saw that in the march of return from south to north that happened despite the fact that many analysts were saying this Netzarim corridor that separates the north from the south will never go away, but it did. We see an exchange of prisoners agreement in the ceasefire agreement as well. We're seeing the entry of more humanitarian aid. We're seeing a lot of different things that the resistance managed to negotiate in many ways. But if you ask me, did this war achieve its potential at this moment? No, it could have been better as well, the results. I mean, if we, if Hezbollah, for instance, didn't have, the assassination and the walkie-talkies and this kind of intelligence infiltration that allowed for Israel to weaken it and batter it, and you had this continuation of this war with all of these forces playing to their strength, and also harming Israel in terms of a attritional warfare. Perhaps we could have seen different results as well coming out of this war. No. But because, again, October 7th had this moment of pure potentiality. But I do think that we return to this kind of, position of no victory, no defeat. And it's one of the toughest positions to be in. I know a lot of people here in Palestine, like on an emotional level, it's just like either let's have a final defeat or, a final victory. We want to just have salvation now. And it's a quite normal feeling, because you don't want to still be stuck in this kind of position of you're not totally defeated. The Palestinian issue still survives. The cause now has gained a lot of support across the world. Palestine is now on the minds of millions of people, if not tens of millions of people across the globe. We've made headway in many ways in many places, but in terms of and we proved perhaps that the region cannot really be stable without a real resolution for the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian resistance was able to, through the unity of field strategy, to drag in all of these different forces to support it. The issue of fighting in Palestine was not contained only in Palestine. It became a regional fight. These are all successes, if you want, for the Palestinian resistance, no? But at the same time, despite that, we're not coming out of this war, having, decolonized. The colonial regime that we live under is deformed, but we still don't have decolonization. There's still potential to transform this moment into political gains, but also Israel will attempt its best through its network of alliances, through its relationship with the United States, through the relationship with the Arab governments, to not allow the political grammar to emerge. and to maintain the Palestinian the security manageable issue without any type of political talk or negotiations or anything like that.
This is very rich. Thanks a lot for this analysis. I do want to stay in Gaza and Operation October the 7th. And you mentioned the prisoners exchange happened and Nitzurim corridor has been dismantled and the march of return from south to north. I mean, I can't help but wondering and joining all these people who are wondering in the West, why are prisoners exchange so important for Hamas and for the Palestinian mentality in general? You know, so important to the point that we risk exposing Gaza to a literal genocide to pursue the release of the Palestinian prisoners. How important are prisoners in the Palestinian psyche?
Well, look, I'll speak to that, but I disagree with the premise a bit of the question, because I don't think, look, if the Palestinian resistance in Gaza wanted a prisoner exchange agreement only, they had an option of a limited form of operation. They could have infiltrated a border area, one position in Israel, took a couple of soldiers, kidnapped them, returned with them, and you would have had a prisoner exchange agreement in the future where you see also thousands of Palestinian prisoners being released. So you could have had that possibility, no? I think the design of October 7th or Tufan al-Aqsa on a military level strategically was not necessarily intended simply to only exchange prisoners. That's one of the objectives. However, it's not necessarily the main objective. It's just to make that distinction. So I don't think Hamas or Katab al-Qassam risked this type of war. Although nobody really risks, nobody would anticipate genocide. Even in your worst case analysis of what Israel could respond with, you would not, think that they will go for a genocidal war. But at the same time, even though you wouldn't anticipate that, I don't think the design of the operation was only about prisoners. Prisoners is one of the goals, and I think it's even a minor, because again, if it was the main goal, you could have done a very limited operation, kidnapped a couple of soldiers, and then waited until Israel was ready to negotiate to release Palestinian prisoners. But to your question about the psychology, I think that for Palestinians, the idea of leaving, their leaders, their fighters, their political and civil society and munadilin, what we say strugglers, behind bars for decades is very shameful. I mean, nobody would leave people in prison to rot, and specifically if they're political prisoners, and specifically if they're political leaders as well, and specifically if they're people who you as a society admire and respect and want to extract from Israeli jails. So this kind of incarceration system that we live under, that places Palestinians in a position where many prisoners in the past a couple of years have reached 30 and 40 years in imprisonment without being released, has become a source of shame for a lot of the political and armed movements, that something needs to be done to release them. And Israel, of course, is uninterested in any release without, forcing it through, through also, taking in Israeli prisoners. This is the only way to release these prisoners. At least historically, there was two ways. The first was, sometimes through this kind of gestures of goodwill that happened through negotiations, but they're also very limited, and only a couple of Palestinian prisoners would be released, and they're not significant. And the second way was, historically speaking, through an exchange of prisoners. So for these political movements, remember Hamas, people like Sinwar were in prison, no? He's a prisoner himself. He left his friends and buddies in prison. So for him, it's also a personal matter, not only, a political matter. It's also releasing those people who he was with in prison, his friends, his comrades, etc. So I think for Palestinians more broadly, because many Palestinian families and all of us, since 1967, 1 million Palestinians were arrested. almost a third of the population of men uh, were arrested. We're talking about this kind of policy of mass confinement. Everybody has tasted, the pain of being imprisoned, humiliated, dehumanized, and treated in subpar conditions in Israeli prisons. But at the same time, there's a lot of prisoners who are serving life sentences, and the only way to release them is through a prisoners exchange agreement. And psychologically and politically, that's significant for political movements. Also, another level because it provides them with a lot of political legitimacy in the eyes of the Palestinian population. But again, Ahmed, I don't think that the operation was only intended to release prisoners.
I totally agree with you. I think the main intention was prisoners exchange, lifting the siege, improving the life of Palestinians who've been imprisoned in Gaza Strip for the past 16 years then. So just improving the lives and livelihood of the people was the main goal, to my understanding. Many people in the West keep saying that, in any future system of a Palestinian governance in Gaza or in the West Bank, we need to see more or a stronger secular contribution, and less, regressive or conservative contributions, such as Hamas's contribution, for example. What's your response to that?
Well, I mean, look, I think that uh, one of the sensitivities I have is for people from outside of Palestine trying to tell us how we should perform or look or act or I'm personally, more of a leftist secular type of guy, like I'm not an Islamist in any way or shape or form. But I think that one of the things we should recognize at this particular political moment, while the secular, perhaps left and nationalists played a big role in the 70s and 80s in the Palestinian struggle, today these forces have either, sold out, to be honest, or are weakened and have very little role. I'm not trying to undermine anybody's role in the Palestinian political field, but very little role. And since the 80s, the mantle of resistance, defiance, the organizational capacity, the accumulation of power has been really moved or shifted towards, if you want, political movements and formations that, adopt this idea of Islamic universality, including people or movements like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others. That's the reality, no? And these are the political forces that now have, more legitimacy in the eyes of the, everyday Palestinian, if you want. Not necessarily ideologically, Hamas, but also looking at Hamas and its resistance and its capacity would find in Hamas hope, no? And its ability to provision some sort of struggle to open political possibilities, to defy the Israeli military machine. So there's that level of relationship. But the ideological and political struggle in Palestine, even if we're like talking about Palestinian state or whatever, will continue. People will have different views over, lifestyles, over social and economic issues, over the type of economy Palestinians want to have, the type of world and worldview that they want to adopt. And I don't think necessarily that in on average Palestinians, are that ideologically committed to any form of if you want pure ideologies. What they're committed to is first of all liberty and liberating themselves from the shackles of occupation. And then I think that in the future, even Hamas itself and a lot of the Islamist parties, I mean, that's one of the problems I have with them, coming a bit from the tradition of the left, is that, we see them largely looking at countries like Turkey and Erdogan as a model, which is, neoliberal economy. They want to trade in the military suit with like the business suit. They want to have a modern economy. Even they speak even liberal talk, which is, for me, quite problematic. They have very good relationship to capitalism and capitalist, drivers in society. I mean, as a person who's a bit slightly wary of that type of discourses, etc., I see that problem among a lot of the Islamist movements, that they have this kind of reconciliation with capitalism, specifically in forms that, completely overlook the working classes, etc. But, in a nutshell, I think, these issues are for us as Palestinians to fight over. That's in a post occupation, post colonial situation, because you're asking me that question in that sense. But what I would say right now, the delineation in Palestine is between forces who resist and defy and forces who cooperate with Israel. Doesn't matter what their ideological, background is, but that's the main political, if you want, fissure or line that separates, for instance, political parties today like Fatah and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and political parties like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the PFLP and the DFLP, who have, resistance operating on the ground in Gaza and other places. In a nutshell, the delineation is not about secular Islamists. The delineation is more resistance and cooperation. And that's the main thread, that's the main dividing line in Palestinian society. It's tied to this existential question that faces Palestinians: how to survive the onslaught of Israel's military machine. And one takes this kind of proactive political position, which is we have to resist. And here resistance is much more than armed resistance. It's building institutions, it's maintaining social cohesion, it's ensuring that society, social units remain healthy, that families do not break up, that there's a lot of work socially, politically, and economically that goes into the idea of resistance, and also in daily acts, etc. And those who argue that it's no use to resist Israel, it's futile to resist it because it's much more stronger. And because it's that strong, the only hope we have for survival is through cooperation. And you see that through the security coordination mechanism, for instance. Of course, for some of the elite in the Palestinian Authority, that cooperation is lubricated through their ability to extract surplus or through their ability to extract financial gains from the system that they control, no? But in many ways, so they act like these, in literature, we call it like comprador classes, a link between the colonial state and the indigenous population. They're in the middle, they mediate between both, and at the same time, they maintain security, they play their role, and they extract their own, benefit and financial gains and etc. For themselves and their families, etc. But in a nutshell, that's the main delineation. Today, it's not about being secular or leftist or Islamist or not Islamist or nationalist or whatever your orientation is. And I think that even the general Palestinian population, that's the main discussion. That's the main thread line. That's the main fissure line in Palestinian politics, if you want.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, unfortunately, there's some in the Palestinian community that can't see past the governance in the West Bank and the governance in Gaza to be able to actually see the bigger picture of occupation, colonization. Like you said, the delineation should be around whether you're resisting the occupation and the colonization, or you're collaborating with it, or you're being, too lenient with it, and so on and so forth. Thank you so much for this analysis. It's just incredible to have these kind of insights. In terms of, you mentioned decolonization. In terms of decolonization and eventual acceptance by the aggressor of the validity of the fight. So do you consider the resolution of the English IRA, for example, to be an example to this kind of how decolonization would look like for Palestinians?
I mean, I have no, I think like one of the problems with trying to delineate what form of relationality can arise in a context where Israelis recognize the need for a resolution where they have to live equally with Palestinians. My fear is that Israelis don't want to do that. like they would rather leave than actually live in equality with others, no, in on the land. That the part of the joy and the pleasure of being a settler also in historic Palestine is to practice these forms of apartheid and ethno supremacy and Jewish supremacy that we have, witnessed. I have that suspicion. I'm not sure. I mean, but knowing, knowing and looking at a lot of the historical examples of decolonization, there are sometimes political accommodations made between, the indigenous population and those who came to settle the land violently. But I think that decolonization means, in my own sensibility, the emergence of a new humanity, the emergence of a new form of relationality, the end of this kind of colonized binary, and the move forward towards something totally different and radically new. So, in that sense, I'm not sure the Israelis are willing to go into that journey. There are different theories of how you can decolonize land. One is like through overwhelming force. So you're able to completely and militarily defeat the colonial state. The other is through mutual, I guess, recognition, end of decolonization. Symbolically, the settler stops being a settler. So that's how, and you can find a new form of life, humanity. I don't know, state form, non-state form that could arise out of this kind of process. So it's hard. But my suspicion is that Israelis don't want to live with us as equal human beings. I mean, I don't think Palestinians have a problem with that on a fundamental level. I think some Palestinians do, that they would think after this rivers of blood and all the pain and the killing, that they cannot muster the ability to live with those who have committed or participated or were complicit in the commitment of these crimes. And that's a common sentiment as well among Palestinians. But in general, I think that when we talk about decolonization, we're just speaking about a horizon of a new relationality altogether, devoid of hierarchies, devoid of these binaries, and thinking of something totally different, totally new. This is what I think when I think of molding the consciousness, killing the settler, not in the sense of actually murdering the settler, but killing the settler in a symbolic sense, and for them to dealing themselves from settler colonialism, from erasure, from ethno supremacy, from that is possible. I'm not sure if that's gonna happen. Perhaps it won't. And we're locked into this binary for the foreseeable future. But at least that's part of what the struggle should be about, no?
We had Professor Hayim Brashid Zabna last week, and he spoke about how the Jewish minds were Zionized and kind of almost brainwashed into believing into this racist ideology that is the main policy of the State of Israel. And the indoctrination is so deep. Do you think the abolishment of Zionism and that what comes with it of racism and supremacy, do you think that would also constitute a resolution to decolonize eventually?
Yeah, of course. I mean, if Israelis see Palestinians as humans, then you have it ends. No? I mean, if they don't see them as threats, as a racialized other, as hordes of people that have no rights or claims to the land, if that stops, if that kind of mentality that has accompanied, because there's no colonization without a racial ideology around it. No, you can't massacre and kill people without at least having some sort of, because you have to be able to sleep at night, and so you have to dehumanize that other, which is in this case the Palestinian, and you have to downgrade their humanity. You have to look at them as regressive people or whatever it is that you tell yourself, and that has accompanied Israelis since they first stepped on this land. The Zionist movement spoke of the Fallah, the Palestinian peasant, as a donkey. Spoke of Palestinians as part of the natural environment. They're not people with culture and history and tradition. Of course, ironically, even in the early days of the Zionist colonization, because they didn't know how to actually conduct agriculture from the land, they learned from the peasant, they learned from the Palestinians how to actually cultivate the land. Um, Despite all the buildings that Israelis built, they never been able to build the peasant's house, which is cold in the summer and hot in the winter. These are things that when you speak about the indigenous population of Palestine, they've brought these trees from Europe and implanted them here, and every once in a while, anything they're engulfed in fire, and you have big fires because they're not these plants are not even indigenous to the land because they wanted to make Palestine look more European. Anyways, in a nutshell, in many ways, this racial ideology was part and parcel and remains part and parcel of how Israel constructs itself, constructs its identity, and constructs the other, and in this case, it's the Palestinian. And again, you can't massacre, maim, and kill, and imprison, and humiliate, and degrade the Palestinians without having that kind of racialized mentality around how you do it. And it exists and it continues to exist. And I think, of course, if it ends and you start seeing the Palestinians as human with dignity and with the need for, with their own claims to the land that are rightful and just, and, you ask for forgiveness, for instance, which is important in this process, perhaps Palestinians will be able to think of forgiveness, if Israelis start to ask for it. Maybe we'll have the ability to radically forgive. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't want to speak on behalf of the Palestinians. Maybe not. But that is a process that is possible. And it was possible, by the way, after October 7th as well. When Israel cleared the militants and the Palestinian resistance fighters that entered the Gaza envelope and the settlements that surround Gaza, after that, in pure military terms, there was no need for more violence. Israel could have told itself, maybe we should go for a different direction. It never really asked that question. It went hyper genocide, hyper killing, hyper massacres, and an attempt to decisively end the Palestinian question through ending the Palestinian presence on the land of Palestine.
100%. And that possibility of forgiveness, I don't think it's an impossibility. I mean, because it happened before. I mean, the Nakba, massive atrocities committed, Deir Yassin and all these, the killing and maiming of Palestinians, the expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians. And, in the 90s, I used to hear that we had some movements inside Israel, Arab Israelis, talking about coexisting and all these talks. So it's not an impossibility for the Palestinians to actually forgive and start over. I don't know what you think about that.
I'm not sure because I think people have different, again, and I think all of these positions are legitimate. But the thing, the main issue, Ahmad, is that nobody's asking for forgiveness yet. No, so we still don't, we're thinking about something that has not happened.
Absolutely.
Now, if somebody actually asks for forgiveness, then the question becomes relevant and pertinent. But at this current moment, this is just intellectual play. No, I mean, but for a lot of Palestinians, they can't. They would say, "Look, I will never forgive. I will never forget." This is the position. I have so much anger, and I think it's more. It's. If you didn't have anger, I would suspect your humanity. Like that's my own position. Like if you're Palestinian without anger, you would suspect your humanity. I mean, the other day I was like sitting with a bunch of colleagues, and we were speaking about this kind of paradigm where, in many ways, we don't have that much hate. No, like in our hearts, it's like even though all of this destruction happened and killing and massacres, it's not like we have this kind of like we were amazed that the Palestinians are not like that hateful, that we still are, we're angry, we're sad, we're despondent, we're feeling a lot of different feelings, but that anger towards, Israelis on an individual level or collective level is there, but it's not in ways that you would imagine for a population that has been, undergoing genocide. And and people were lamenting, like, why aren't we capable of mustering that type of, hate, like, or anger, or these emotions. They were lamenting this because they were saying it's like, you know, the way they treat us, the way they kill us, the way they massacre us, the way they celebrate sadistically, in an obscene fashion on TikTok, and destroying homes and sending it as birthday gifts to their daughters. I mean, and we're just amazed how such a population would be, not only engaging in massacres, but being unashamed of being engaged in massacres and killing and destruction, and celebrating that, and obscenely placing them on Facebook and TikTok. And we were wondering why we don't have that type of hate, despite of that, this total hate, this total anger, despite the scenes that we've been seeing, and despite all the killing and anger.
It's definitely an interesting observation. It's not much about the hate, it's the anger, it's the frustration, it's the depression that comes with it, and sadness, all these feelings. But it's never hate, which is interesting. Israel has shown that it doesn't really have a clear, realistic strategic goal. At this stage of a fragile ceasefire, do you believe the Palestinian resistance has a clear plan B if or when Israel breaks the ceasefire?
Well, look, I mean, there's three levels to that question. The first is, why did Israel choose to do a ceasefire in the first place? So one element is, we can say, like, it was American pressure, that forced it to do a ceasefire. The second element, we would say, no, its army, it's battered. It lost a lot of tanks and officers, and a lot of injuries in its soldiers and its corps, and fighting forces, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza. And the need for a ceasefire was also there, because despite 4 months of fighting in north of Gaza, and a lot of destruction in north of Gaza, around 60 soldiers were killed in the span of 3 or 4 months. So Israel was entering into this kind of guerrilla fighting attrition, where it slowly started to lose the will to fight and continue, and it still had this issue of Israeli prisoners. So this is one paradigm of it. And why I'm saying that is that the return to fight is not about solely completely an easy step for Israel to make, because I think that in many ways its army doesn't see what it can do in Gaza that it hasn't done already in terms of destruction. We should bring these prisoners back. Perhaps they will maintain some sort of direct military engagement through air power and stand firepower. But I think the idea of returning to Gaza as a fighting force is for now not necessarily a real option in Israel or for the Israeli army. It could happen. I'm not like completely ruling it out, but I don't see it, returning in the fashion that it used to be, at least in the past couple of months, or since Israel invaded Gaza last year. So that's one level of it. The second level is that Israel is now heading towards a confrontation directly with Iran or not? Because that's that's one of the puzzles that is missing in its strategic picture. It hadn't really harmed the nuclear program in Iran. Slowly and steadily, we could see Israel moving towards and getting the green light to hit the Iranian nuclear program. If it feels that Americans will back it, or Trump will have the green lighted this. And it's possible that in the next month that's the major focus for Israel in terms of its military direct engagement, would be to actually attack Iran, or apply the threat of attack and a mix of economic pressure to reach perhaps some sort of agreement on the nuclear power or the nuclear program in Iran through the Americans and the Europeans. So there's that one element that remains in the picture. The second element is what will happen to Saudi-Israeli normalization and to the Gaza in a post-war paradigm. Whether we'll see Hamas remain in power, whether we'll see a unity agreement, whether we'll see, different arrangements, what Israel will accept or not accept, is also a question. But to answer the question in a broader, I think, or more fundamental sense, Israel's solution for the Palestinian issue and its decisive end is ethnic cleansing and genocide. Whatever works, or both, a mix of both. Because if you don't want to live with Palestinians, and if Palestinians also will muster every once in a while resistance in different shapes and forms, will still claim this land is theirs, you haven't really resolved the foundational violence, you haven't really legitimated Israel foundationally. There's still a struggle over Palestine. That struggle will continue in generations or will continue through time. But if you want to truly end the Palestinian question, the Israelis will have to end the Palestinian people. That is the realization that the Israeli right wing, it has been selling to Israeli society for the past decade or so. Remember that October 7th also come as a response to these rising forces. Because Ben Gvir's decisive plan was put well before October 7th. Bezalel Smotrich, who's also a right-wing fascist who serves now as the finance minister in the Israeli government, wrote a decisive plan, something called a decisive plan. You can check it on Google and place his name and you can read it, which gives Palestinians three options: either being slaves in a Jewish state, and completely abdicating any political or any other rights, or resisting and getting killed, or leaving Palestine. That's the three options he gives Palestinians. And in many ways, that drive within Israeli society, the rise of this kind of fascist messianic right wing, and its increasing power and leverage within Israeli institutions, and its representation of this collective unconscious that Israeli society that the entire Israeli society quite desires, which is for the Palestinians to disappear, and driving Israel to unleash power, to unleash their weapons, to unleash their force over Palestinian bodies, to brutalize them more, to kill them more, to arrest more, and for prison conditions to be even worse. So this is the spearhead of the Zionist movement now. These are the forces that are the spearhead of the Zionist movement. And their solution is genocide and ethnic cleansing. Again, this was well before October 7th. And for anybody who's following closely Israeli politics, will look and see that Israel was heading towards, in this century, to commit what it had committed in Gaza. And this is why I still insist, that despite the destruction in Gaza is the only place in historic Palestine that has a chance to stay or remain, because it has accumulated enough power. It has a relationship between the population and an active armed resistance. And it will be very hard for Israel to actually really clear or ethnically cleanse or completely render Gaza or Gazans or Palestinians in Gaza outside of Gaza. What in the West Bank would happen is totally different, because you have this collaborationist regime that is not accumulating power, that is not trying to defy Israel. I'm not saying even in an active sense, in the long term, building the edifice, trying to secure society, trying to build the power to remain resilient, but engaging in this collaborationist, accommodationist type of politics. The West Bank is actually the real prize for the Zionist settler movement as well. This is where 700,000 Israeli settlers live. Many of the fighting force among the Israeli army that actually was in Gaza, they hail from the West Bank settlements and from the movement from the religious Zionists. And this is the solution that they're offering in the medium run, which is if they're permitted, and of course, Israel has the will to go through, is that in this century or in the years to come, they want to decisively end the question of Palestine, decisively end the Palestinian people's existence in the land of Palestine. So that's the solution. That's the strategic picture that they're thinking of, and that's the priority that this movement has placed. No. Now, in Israel, there are different, if you want, competing forces. Not that many people disagree with what the religious Zionist movement is saying, but for other Israelis, they take into consideration that they have peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan, and they cannot disturb the peace in Egypt and Jordan. That they should also heed American calls and architecture. That an ethnic cleansing campaign and genocide needs the approval of the Americans, the Europeans, and to some degree, of course, Arab countries before they embark on this type of solution. And that's why we're seeing, for instance, this push by Netanyahu and Trump to normalize the discourse of ethnic cleansing and genocide and to make it politically more realistic. Whether it's a negotiating or a position or not, what it tells us is that this is a signaling of what comes in the years and decades ahead for us in Palestine. Yeah.
Absolutely. Abdaljawad, you mentioned the difference between the strategies of the governance in Gaza and the West Bank, between the collusionist, collaborationist kind of policies in the West Bank, and then you have defiance and resistance and committing to, the decolonization aspect of it. Are we ever going to see unity with these kind of differences between the political parties?
Well, you would see unity if one gives on the paradigm, no? If Hamas doesn't want to resist anymore, maybe we'll see unity. And if Fatah re-enters Palestinian resistance and defiance as a paradigm, we might see some sort of unity. It might still hold some competition even within these paradigms, but at least fundamentally there will be an agreement on something, no? But as long as we're in this position where the current leadership of the Palestinian Authority is totally immersed in a politics of collaboration in the name of the nation, something like the Vichy regime in France that collaborated with the Nazis, no? And at the same time, you have Hamas, which still thinks that resistance is the way forward and remains the only answer to Zionist colonization. I don't think that we'll see unity in a significant way. There might be sometimes, pragmatic accommodations here or there, For instance, now the idea of a technocratic PA-led government, Palestinian Authority government, coming into Gaza, and holding the levers over power there might entice Hamas because it wants to unburden itself from governing and reconstruction and all of that, but at the same time maintain its fighting force on the ground and the ability to accumulate power, recruits, resistance, and to maintain its project of resistance. This is something that Hamas wants, at least in terms of, the other side of the question that was asked: do Palestinians have a strategy? I think that Palestinians, the question of strategy, generally speaking, Ahmad, and for the audience, for Palestinians is for any Palestinian who attends conferences here in Palestine, academic or policy-oriented conferences, the first common thing that Palestinians say is that we lack strategy, we lack a program, Oslo killed so there's these kind of like highly repetitive, if you want, statements or common sense that have become common sense among Palestinians is that Palestinians don't have a strategy. I think Hamas now, after the destruction of Gaza, its strategy is that it does not want to enter, first of all, into a contradiction with the Palestinians in Gaza and the population more broadly. It wants to ensure its priority, it wants to ensure that there is a real reconstruction in Gaza in the coming months and years. No? That is the first fundamental element that it wants. And it wants to navigate the political terrain so that Israel would not use the leverage it has to stop the reconstruction or halt it or postpone it or, play with it or, use that leverage more because Gaza is besieged. So it doesn't want to enter into contradiction with the population more broadly. That's one element that it wants to get out of it. And it wants to also maintain resistance and the resistance movements in Gaza. That's the two elements that Hamas will be placing front and center as it moves forward throughout the months and weeks ahead. That's my opinion, and what they will try to achieve is how we maintain resistance and at the same time ensure livelihood, which goes back to the contradiction of having governance and resistance in the same, space. And I think Hamas on that level is willing to give up on governance in some form to be able to maintain and sustain resistance on another form. So questions of war and peace will remain in hands. That's what it at least looks forward to. Now, whether it's able to achieve that, depending on the geostrategic environment, depending on the extent to which it holds its self-steady in the ground, depending on the levels of support it has among Palestinians in Gaza as well, and the level of steadfastness of the population. There's a lot of different flux factors that will interplay to ensure whether it can sustain that paradigm or not. Because if the Arabs want to force it, that will not pay unless you surrender, or it will get into a very tough position, or will be backed into a corner that will be difficult. And that's one of the fears, at least in the couple of months ahead, is that what Israel couldn't achieve in war, it might be able to achieve in peace. That's a new war that is basically dismantling the Palestinian resistance through, embezzling the Palestinians on the reconstruction of Gaza, and the entry of materials into the Gaza Strip and all the support it needs for that type of reconstruction. But we'll see what happens with the negotiation of phase 2 and phase 3 as we move forward.
I guess we'll see a lot of speculations out there. How does the geopolitics figure into the future of Palestine? Morocco, Western Sahara, Algeria, US tariffs on all countries, Europe being isolated by the US Trump, the African Union response to the genocide in Gaza, South Africa, the Arab Union. Do you think finally some collective support for Palestine against Israel and the US might materialize somehow out of these kind of restructurings?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of promising changes. So, the relative power of the collective West is also in decline compared to the rise of many countries and centers of power, whether it's Brazil, China, other centers of power across the world, including in Africa, etc. So that's one promising element moving forward in terms to what extent can these new rising power be leveraged to bring about a different form of relationship to this colonial project in Palestine in the name of Israel. That's one element of it. And I think that, we've seen the position of South Africa. One of the levels, I think, of Gaza's war is that it reminded a lot of post-colonial countries of colonialism. No? It reminded them of their own genocides, their own histories of pain. And I think that resonated a lot with a lot of people across the globe, beyond the Western Europe and North America. So I think that is also another element. The problem still in the region is that America still is the power that hegemonizes through its network of alliances and comprador class rulers in many of the Arab countries, still has a lot of lever and power for now. The regional architecture hasn't really been, able to completely liberate itself from American hegemony and European meddling yet. And Arab sovereignty, or rulers who think of sovereignty or think of Arab issues on Arab terms, this is still a missing component and part. And in the past 2 decades or 3 decades, we also have seen the decline of Arab nationalist forces. We have seen the decline of countries that had some lever like Iraq and Libya and the breakdown of these states in Sudan, etc., civil wars. Much of it is also imperial intervention. Much of it is also tied some way or another to maintaining Israel as a hegemon in the region. So I think that there's still that problem. I don't think Iran and the resistance of resistance axis was one component of this kind of anti-hegemonic power that is attempting to build influence in the region, not totally beholden to America and having a different position in terms of independence from it. But it's now weakened. It's a bit battered. It lost, from its own perspective, Syria. It has Hezbollah, weakened and battered as well. So in that picture, at least in the short term, at least, what I'm not seeing is that there's a fundamental change in the region. In fact, maybe we can say that, these governments and normalization, adopt normalization and are beholden to American hegemony in the region still remain strong and steady, at least for now.
Would the people of Gaza tolerate a comprador government?
Look, I think the problem with I don't think people in Gaza would tolerate it. I don't think Palestinians in the West Bank tolerate it either. But the problem is, for me, it's always a question of what is the organizational force that can stop it. So in Gaza, there is an organizational force that can stop it, and it's the existence of a Palestinian armed resistance movement, which is stronger, and you wouldn't be able to get a comprador class in Gaza because of the ability of the current of resistance to also resist the rise of a comprador class. In the West Bank, for instance, the conditions that led to a comprador class is the existence of the Israeli military within the West Bank itself, which conducts arrest operations and assassination of leaders that want or desire to build and accumulate power and resistance. So it deprives the Palestinians from, those who adopt resistance or have a current of resistance, because they can enter any town, any village, arrest, kill on a daily basis routinely. And at the same time, because of the economic imperative, which is now one of the areas where the Palestinian resistance movement in Gaza had a problem, because it have to manage a way to reconstruct Gaza and maintain resistance. Although it's surrounded by hostile forces, whether it's Egypt and Israel, and besieged, and those who are maybe willing to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza, or at least inject a lot of money, are Arab governments who are also very differential to American and Israeli demands. So we'll have to navigate that element and that contradiction that it has between how we maintain resistance and at the same time ensure reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. So, but I think that nobody really tolerates these regimes. But there are sometimes economic necessities, and then also a lot of repression and corrosion that goes into sustaining them.
You spoke about the resistance in Gaza. How will the concept of resistance in support of the Palestinian struggle for justice endure, in the face of this another Trump administration? Even resistance in the sense that, in the Palestine solidarity movement in the West, we're seeing a lot of repression. We expect it to actually deepen. So that is the concept of resistance. How is it going to endure another Trump tenure?
Well, I mean, look, I think for us in Palestine, we have really no choice, because, just remaining here is partially resistance, not leaving, not immigrating, trying to be, resistance is forced upon us. Remember that resistance emanates from necessity. It's not simply an ideological or political choice. It's just, somebody's expanding and taking over. It's like being with somebody in the elevator and he's growing fat all the time and choking you. So at some point you need to just push them around, or try to leave the elevator, or do something so you don't, die. So resistance in Palestine will exist in different shapes and forms. whether it's organized, whether it's a political movement that, organizes it and builds its edifice and increases and accumulates power, or whether it remains, dispersed, but there will still always be resistance in Palestine because it emanates from that necessity. But yeah, one of the problems, again, with movements that arise from political events is that we see them dwindle and lose energy after, a ceasefire. Remember, and I said this before, there's no ceasefire in Palestine. There's always issues to highlight. There's always killings to talk about. But I think in many ways, partially, movements have to also build some institutionalization around it. And sometimes these moments offer us the ability to bring out, for instance, a new media initiatives, or bring out, for instance, organization around BDS, and institutionalize these type of movements in ways that ensures their sustainability and their ability to be more proactive strategically in terms of how they want to engage in Australia, for instance, or what they see as their main objectives and strategies in other areas. That's the only, I think, that's an important element, because institutions survive logics of affective, if you want, reactions to events, and they can sustain themselves. Of course, you won't get the same momentum, perhaps, or the same presence of thousands or tens of thousands of people who participate in demonstrations, but you're able still to strategize, to lobby, to highlight in the media, to engage in different forms of civic engagements that these movements choose, or whatever form of direct action they also choose to engage in.
Absolutely. Look, Abdaljawad, I can't get enough of you. It's been a really, really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for this fantastic insight.
Thanks, Ahmed.
You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.